We are starting this video at the Charter Street Cemetery. It is located in the middle of the city of Salem. As you can see, it is in good condition and well maintained. There is a council employee at the gate handing out maps and answering questions during business hours. Sadly, the only grave which relates to the witch trials themselves is Judge John Hathorne. There are some members of the Putnam family, but not the ones who were involved in the trials. The real story of the trials is different to the Crucible. In the real story, Anne Putnam is the one who first started naming people. Abigail is only very young, Proctor is a man in his 60s, and there's no indication of a relationship between them. After the trials, Anne Putnam begged for the forgiveness of the town. There is no statutory criminal law in the colonies at this time, and without legal training, the Court of Assistants, the Governor, Deputy Governor, and some other assistants judged cases and punishments based on what they knew of English law, and by their instincts of what they thought was right. The primary English law about witchcraft made witchcraft a felony. A witch convicted of a minor offence could receive a year in prison, but any witch accused and found guilty a second time was sentenced to death. Juries were commonly reluctant to charge people with witchcraft, often awarding a lighter sentence. It was not unusual for people to be accused of witchcraft, but often it never made it to court. The Salem Witch Trials were declared unlawful in 1702, and in 1711 a bill passed which restored the rights and good names to the accused. It was not until 1957, though, when Massachusetts issued a formal apology for the events that took place in Salem in 1692. Here's the restored grave of Judge John Hathorne, who was one of the judges who lived in town. He was one of the most vocal participants in the trial, and was one of the few people who never publicly apologised or expressed remorse for his role in the trials. Judge Hathorne lived on present-day Washington Street, a short walk from home to court. We will finish this video with a tour of his house, which is now called Witch House. Interestingly, he was the grandfather of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who changed his family name to distance himself from the actions of his grandfather. Right next to the cemetery is the memorial for the victims of the Salem Witch Trials. At the opening, there are stones which contain famous and powerful words from the victims of the trials. The memorial is shaped like a horseshoe, with half the victims' memorial stones on one side and the other half on the other side. At the base of the horseshoe, there's a fence which makes it feel more like it's in the cemetery. It's a very beautiful spot with lots of stonework and trees. We start with the first victim, Bridget Bishop. The stone reads, Bridget Bishop hanged, June 10, 1692. They've kept this simple format for all the victims. Next we have Sarah Good, hanged June 19, 1692. As you can see, people have put tokens on the memorials. Here we have Rebecca Nurse, hanged July 19, 1692. Here's the point where the governor had returned, which I'll talk more about later. He could have prevented every death after this. Now here is John Proctor, hanged August 19, 1692. Giles Corey is the only person who has a different cause of death because, as we know, he was not hanged as he refused to address the charges against him. After him is his wife. Finally, we have a stone about the creation of this memorial. This is not an original building on the site. It's a replica of the Salem Meeting House, which was built in the 1980s. This building would have doubled as a church, as a meeting house for the town meetings, or as a courthouse as needed. Please disregard the modern chairs. This is where the Rebecca Nurse tour guides start their tour, and these chairs are easier to move than the pews. This is exactly the type of building where the Salem witch trials would have occurred, because the nearest courthouse was in Boston, and they were not going to move proceedings if they didn't have to, especially for people like Giles Corey who were in and out of court. So what they did was they had their own little town house for small trials. In 1684, the charter of the colonies had been temporarily suspended due to political and religious friction between the colony and England. A new charter of 1691 arrived from England in May of 1692. In the middle of trials, along with the new governor. But at the time of the trials, the General Court had not had time to create any laws. This was one of the things which added to the perfect storm of Salem. The seasoned governor and the seasoned minister were both in England at the time, meaning they had the deputy lieutenant lawmaker, and he was not as confident or experienced.
In the absence of guidance by specific colony laws and acting in the general paranoia of the community, the judges famously accepted spectral evidence and other untrustworthy kinds of evidence as proof of guilt. Moreover, the magistrates let it be known that an accused witch could avoid execution by confessing, repenting, and putting the blame on someone else. This caused the accusations to multiply. 19 men and women were executed by hanging. One was pressed to death, and others died in prison. They also had 6 new people in the city of Salem, which was virtually unheard of. These people had come from what is now Maine and had endured King Philip's War, also known as the First Indian War, which took place in southern New England from 1675 to 1676. It was the Native Americans' last ditch effort to avoid recognizing English authority and stop English settlement on their native lands. This would have been violent and a horrific time. These people were clearly traumatized, adding to the tension and paranoia at the time. We see that reflected in Abigail's character and description of the fear of the Native Americans. On top of that, Samuel Parris was the fourth minister they'd had in 20 years. So in the play, he is depicted as quite unlikable, but it seems they were actually driving out ministers. So they were withholding food and firewood to try and drive him out. 2 years after the Salem Witch Trials, the governor banned people writing about it. When he came back from England, he realized what was happening. He ignored the advice from his attorney general, who told him to stop the trials. Instead, he wrote a letter to the king, which is a choice he is criticized for. This letter had to travel by sea to England, be addressed by the king, and then travel back by sea. In this time, more people died. He could have saved more than half of the victims by preventing the August and September executions. Rebecca Nurse would have still died as she was executed in July, but Proctor and Giles Corey would have lived. The king instructed the governor to make the choice himself, as he was there and could more effectively understand the situation. But while this letter was in transit, the governor's wife was accused of witchcraft, and he ended the trials by removing things like spectral evidence. He could have also banned writing about the trials so they could fade from memory, allowing the town to heal. This was a small community, and within a few generations, people could be marrying people whose ancestors had caused the death of their own ancestors. We're touring the Nurse family homestead. A homestead is a house or a farmhouse and outbuildings. We are outside the house of the Nurse family homestead. We'll be in there in a minute. The low ceiling kitchen is right in front of us, and this is her garden, which does need a little attention. We're now on the other side of the building. This is the view from outside of their front door. Obviously, it's a little different because it's more than 300 years later, but it gives you some idea of what they might have seen, and it is very beautiful. We have the house here, which has been pretty lovingly restored. Apparently, this is even the original door frame. Here are the steps to the second story. At the time, they would have had a ladder, which would have been difficult for Rebecca in her old age and illness. Here is the main room of the house with the fireplace. So, for poorer people, they would have all lived in one room, but for the Nurse family, they had 2 rooms. We have an additional room, which was added by Rebecca Nurse's son after her death when he took over the property. There is a very low ceiling here, which makes this room retain heat. This room overlooks the garden, which is where we were before. This is the room Rebecca Nurse would have been in when she was accused. Her husband Francis had some knowledge of the law, and he was trying to save her and build a defense from the start. This is the fireplace again, and it is difficult to see, but they have holes at the back, about the size of a microwave, where they would put dishes to cook. But you have to lean over the fire to put things in and out. This is the inside of the original second room of the house, upstairs bedroom, which is directly on top of the room we were just in. You can see here some furniture, including 2 baby cots. I don't know if these are from the late 1600s or not. This is what the windows would have looked like, and they would have had glass in them at the time. This bed is called a rope bed. and would have been more than likely in a one-bedroom house as it folds up to save space. This right here is a fixed frame bed, which would have been more likely the sort of bed Rebecca Nurse would have been sleeping in. As they would have not had steps and a ladder would have been too difficult for Rebecca, she would have been sleeping downstairs when she was accused. We have a fireplace here directly above the previous fireplace in the kitchen. This is the barn over there. On the other side, a bit further, is the meeting hall. And here is the rest of the property. We're just walking down to Rebecca's memorial. It's a very long walk. You can see the family cemetery in the distance. There isn't a technical grave for her. As she was a witch, she was not buried in consecrated ground or with a headstone. So after the witches had been hanged and Giles Corey had been pressed, they took the bodies and buried them in shallow graves. When it would rain heavily, parts of the body would emerge from the ground, showing you how badly these bodies were treated and how little care the town had for these witches. There is a story about some family members coming at night and removing the bodies of their loved ones. This is pretty believable for the Nurse family, as they were very close. The story goes that they unearthed her body, which was highly inappropriate at the time, and buried her in an unmarked grave in the family cemetery on the property. It was custom at the time to bury husbands and wives next to each other, and as we have a clear grave for Francis Nurse, there is a good chance Rebecca is buried next to him. But as there is no proof, Homestead people will not comment on it. But they did say it is possible. To prove it, they would have to exhume her body. It's very beautiful here, as you can see. It's a shame we couldn't keep the original audio as it's full of bird sounds. In the middle, we have an obelisk, which was dedicated to Rebecca Nurse and was erected by the family. On the back, it says, "Accused of witchcraft, she declared, 'I am innocent, and God will clear my innocence.' Once acquitted, then falsely condemned, she suffered death, July 16, 1692, in loving memory of her Christian character, even then fully attested by 40 of her neighbours. This monument was erected in July 1885. We have here a granite tablet. In the play, Giles Corey brings a petition. This one here was done by the neighbours. This would have put their lives at risk, and the family wanted to honour them. It says this tablet contains the names of who, at risk of their lives, gave written testimony in favour of Rebecca Nurse, 1692. Two of the women who signed this were eventually accused of witchcraft themselves. This is the other side of the obelisk. She was born in Yarmouth, England, and died in Salem. O Christian martyrs, those who truth could die when all about thee owned the hideous lie, the world redeemed from superstition's sway is breathing freer for their sake today. We have here some of her family members whose headstones have been restored. We have Francis Nurse's headstone. While we don't know for certain where she was buried, it's believed they're buried together. He died 3 years after she did, so it's a reasonable assumption that they are buried right here. This house is in the town of Salem on Washington Street and is open to the public. It's now called Witch House. These people would not let us film, but we were allowed to take photos. Hathorne was a well respected man in the Salem community, and after the 1692 trials, he was promoted to the Superior Court in 1702. He resigned in 1712. He never showed remorse for the death sentences he awarded. Hathorne died in 1717 at the age of 76. His grave is in town and can be seen at the start of this video. This image of the interior of the house is a great contrast to the main room we saw in the Nurse homestead. This is an actual poppet which was found in the walls of a house and dates to pretty close to the trials. It's about 15 centimetres tall. I'm unsure of the date it was created. They talked about people putting puppets and shoes in their walls to give them protection. However, doing this was not considered witchcraft and was supposedly common practice for Puritan family, but I'm unsure if that's accurate or just a local story. This is the upstairs room, yet again a great contrast to the nurse home. This room has a fixed bed, some sample clothing, a desk, and a baby's cradle. This small room was at the top of the stairs and was directly above the front door. Behind us are the stairs. To our right is the first bedroom, and to the left is the second bedroom. This bedroom has some photos of the judge's family and a lot of tools which would have been used for making fabric. This is the back of the house where they would have had access to their gardens. There was another room, which was a servant's kitchen, but it was difficult to photograph due to poor lighting. Thank you very much for joining us as we've toured through Salem and had a look at some of the historic sites.